Some very smart investments. He became rich, respected, and important. At age 33, he was elected to the powerful position of president of the Merchants Exchange, and 2 years later, he was mayor of the city of St. Louis. Now that alone gets David Francis's name in the local history books and his picture hanging here in City Hall. But as it turns out, Francis was not just a skilled businessman, but a skilled politician. In fact, he did something that no mayor of St. Louis had ever done before and no mayor of St. Louis has ever done since. At the age of 38, David R. Francis was elected governor of the state of Missouri. During his term, he dealt with controversy, crisis, scandal, the usual legislative and political issues. One of his persistent critics was the editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He thought Governor Francis should be spending more time at home in Missouri instead of Washington, D.C., where he was lobbying to bring a World's Fair to St. Louis, the Columbian Exposition. Despite Francis's efforts, St. Louis lost out to Chicago.
And Francis almost immediately came home from Washington in 1890 and said, okay, there's another anniversary coming up, the 100th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase. And at that point in 1890, 14 years before the fair actually took place, Francis began working on the fair.
Perhaps the greatest monument to David Francis's term as governor is the University of Missouri here in Columbia. They named the heart of the campus Francis Quadrangle in his honor. And in fact, Francis himself considered what he did here to be his greatest achievement while serving as governor of Missouri. It was in the last year of his term, January 9th of 1892, when fire began to burn through the State University's main building.
And Francis was notified at something like 3 in the morning, and he telegraphed back, said, hold the students. And he got on the next train from Jefferson City to Columbia, and he went back and he rallied the students. And basically what he said was, he said, we're going to rebuild this university, we're going to rebuild it right where it is. Please come back. We'd like you to come back in the spring. This was happened over Christmas. And in fact, more students came back for the second semester than had been there at the first.
Within a few weeks, David Francis called a special session of the state legislature to approve spending the money to rebuild. And Francis faced down those who saw this as an opportunity to move the state university to their district.
If any of you votes against this proposal to rebuild the university, to raise the money to rebuild the university in Columbia, I am going to come into your district next year, and I'm going to campaign against you, and I'm going to tell the people what you did. And virtually unanimously, the bill was passed to raise the money to rebuild the school.
The university never closed, and within a year, new campus buildings went up surrounding the site of the old main building. Only the columns were left standing on Francis Quadrangle. At the end of his term, Francis was urged to run for Senate. But his wife Jane, a strong-willed and outspoken woman, said no. They would be going back to St. Louis to finish raising their 6 sons. They built a grand mansion in the central West End. Francis went back to running his business. He stayed active and influential in politics. He served as Secretary of the Interior for the last 6 months of President Grover Cleveland's term. But Francis was always looking ahead to the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase and the goal of a World's Fair. And this time, he got it. In 1900, Congress approved a $5 million appropriation to help finance a World's Fair in St. Louis. Another $5 million was raised in private donations, $5 million more came from the state of Missouri, and work got underway. They chose Forest Park as the site of the fair despite opposition to cutting down all those trees. And soon they saw that opening day would have to be moved from 1903 to 1904. This became the biggest civic project ever. There was a large fair committee with David Francis as exposition president, a job that involved a lot more than ceremonies and posing for pictures, and even more than overseeing finances and construction. When you put on a fair, you have to invite the world to come to your city. which means you have to convince other countries, other governments, to spend their own money to build pavilions, send exhibits and exhibitors and emissaries. Well, in 1903, David Francis got word from Europe that, well, there just wasn't much of a buzz overseas about this fair in St. Louis, and that maybe he'd better come over and do something about it. Francis sailed in February for London and ended up going to Paris, Madrid, Brussels, and Berlin, and the story began to get national attention. Here was this man from Missouri, of all places, meeting with kings, princes, and prime ministers, a straight-talking American who didn't stand on fancy ceremony. The New York Times reported from Berlin that Francis didn't just request a meeting with Kaiser Wilhelm. Francis picked the time that was convenient for him. And not only did the Kaiser agree, he met with Francis privately for nearly an hour, while the American ambassador waited outside. By the time he returned, David Francis and St. Louis's fair were big news.
It was a triumphal tour, and he returns to New York, and he is met by a phalanx of reporters, and the first thing they ask him is if he's going to run for president in the next election. And at that point he says, well, I got a World's Fair to run. But he was a man of tremendous charisma, politically shrewd, and he became this larger-than-life figure.
Francis scored yet another public relations coup in April of 1903, when President Theodore Roosevelt and former President Grover Cleveland both came to St. Louis and stayed with Francis in his Central West End home. It was a year before the opening of the fair, and they had come to dedicate the fairgrounds. Hundreds of thousands of people lined up for a big parade leading to the ceremonies. We, of course, know that it all turned out as Francis had hoped and planned. The city put on the largest World's Fair ever. But just a few months before the opening, in the winter of '04, no one knew for sure just how many people were going to show up, whether the gate receipts would begin to cover the tremendous costs. And they were running out of money. They needed to go back to Congress to ask for an emergency loan just to get them to opening day. There was opposition to committing more taxpayer money to the World's Fair, just as there would be today, but it's no surprise that David R. Francis returned to St. Louis with a $4.5 million loan. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition opened April 30th, 1904. 100,000 people attended the opening day and listened to speeches. This is the image that many today have of David R. Francis, an old-time gentleman with a mustache and a top hat. We don't hear the drawl left from his Kentucky youth, or get the sense of the street smarts of the riverfront trader, the man who could get his way in boardrooms, back rooms, in Congress, and in European palaces. The kind of man who knew how to bring a fair and the world to St. Louis.
One of the things that I admire a lot about David Francis, and that accounted for his success, is that Francis never submitted to the attitude that you often find in St. Louis, which is we're a second-tier city, and we can't do anything big. Francis was not afraid of trying anything, and as a result, the World's Fair still is remembered as one of the great events of the pre-war period.